This is Ian Hartley.
I am Warren Kay.
And I am Sasha Steenbergen.
Welcome to the Rediscovering God Dialogue.
We invite you to join us as we endeavor to see Him more clearly.
As we continue on this journey that we've been on, understanding the God that Jesus knew and rediscovering who God really is, and occasionally with this new perspective of God, we look at passages of Scripture that are puzzling to understand. And so, Ian, would you please introduce to us this passage in Numbers?
Okay, we're talking about trial by ordeal. And this passage in Numbers chapter 5 is an interesting ritual which was given to the Israelites to ascertain the guilt of a woman. It's not often noticed or read. We read it because it has interesting parallels in other rituals in the scriptures, which we will uncover. So here's the story. Numbers chapter 5, verse 11 to 31.
And the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel.
Suppose a man's wife goes astray and she is unfaithful to her husband and has sex with another man, but neither her husband nor anyone else knows about it. She has defiled herself even though there was no witness and she was not caught in the act. If her husband becomes jealous and is suspicious of his wife and needs to know whether or not she has defiled herself, the husband must bring his wife to the priest. He must also bring an offering of 2 quarts or liters of barley flour to be presented on her behalf. Do not mix it with olive oil or frankincense, for it is a jealousy offering, an offering to prove whether or not she is guilty."
Okay, so let me just comment on not having any olive oil or frankincense to go with the barley. That's like eating dry bread. No butter or jam. Like this is not a very festive event. It's a jealousy offering.
Right.
It's a little ironic, though, that she probably is the one that made that barley flour that her husband is now bringing. I'm sorry. The priest will then present her to stand trial before the Lord. He must take some holy water in a clay jar and pour it into dust he has taken from the tabernacle floor.
So let me interrupt there and remind you that the serpent was to eat dust. And that Jesus, when the woman is brought to him taken in adultery, he writes in the dust on the temple floor. It's kind of just an interesting connection there.
Yeah. Little glimpse over time here. When the priest has presented the woman before the Lord, he must unbind her hair and place in her hands the offering of proof, the jealousy offering, to determine whether her husband's suspicions are justified. The priest will stand before her holding the jar of bitter water that brings a curse to those who are guilty. The priest will then put the woman under oath and say to her, "If no other man has had sex with you, and you have not gone astray and defiled yourself while under your husband's authority, may you be immune from the effects of this bitter water that brings on the curse. But if you have gone astray by being unfaithful to your husband and have defiled yourself by having sex with another man..."
At this point, the priest must put the woman under oath by saying, "May the people know that the Lord's curse is upon you when he makes you infertile, causing your womb to shrivel and your abdomen to swell. Now may this water that brings the curse enter your body and cause your abdomen to swell and your womb to shrivel." And the woman will be required to say, "Yes, let it be so. Amen." And the priest will write these curses on a piece of leather and wash them off into the bitter water. He will then make the woman drink the bitter water that brings on the curse.
So I just interrupt you there. This is symbolic of her eating her words, which is an idiom in English.
Right. Interesting. When the water enters her body, it will cause bitter suffering if she is guilty. I guess the option is always for the woman to say, "Oh yeah, okay, I am guilty. I don't need to drink the bitter water and cause herself all kinds of other medical issues and pain and suffering, and just come clean and suffer the consequences of whatever that would entail."
Yeah, and this often happened with trial by ordeal.
Okay.
The priest will take the jealousy offering from the woman's hand, lift it up before the Lord, and carry it to the altar. He will take a handful of the flour as a token portion and burn it on the altar, and he will require the woman to drink the water. If she has defiled herself by being unfaithful to her husband, the water that brings on the curse will cause bitter suffering. Her abdomen will swell and her womb will shrink, and her name will become a curse among her people. But if she has not defiled herself and is pure, then she will be unharmed and will still be able to have children.
This is the ritual law for dealing with suspicion. If a woman goes astray and defiles herself while under her husband's authority, or if a man becomes jealous and is suspicious that his wife has been unfaithful, the husband must present his wife before the Lord, and the priest must apply this entire ritual law to her. The husband will be innocent of any guilt in this matter, but his wife will be held accountable for her sin.
Wow, isn't that an interesting story?
I mean, I could use a stronger word than interesting. I mean, there are a lot of very problematic phrases in this story.
Did I miss that the dust was from the floor, that he scooped it up and put it in this cup?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There
that.
it is. Verse 17.
Yeah.
Take some water and pour it into the dust that he's taken from the temple floor, tabernacle floor. Yeah. Yeah. That's quite an interesting method of determining a person's guilt or innocence.
Especially thinking about the fact that the temple floor would have had a lot of comings and goings, a lot of sacrifices would have been happening. I mean, we talk about, what is it? You get tetanus and stuff like all kinds of things. I'm thinking about, like, this is horrific.
Yeah, I mean, they're walking on paths that are not paved, they're not cleaned, they're, so much so that they wash their feet when they would come into a house. And now this is the dirt that's tracked into the temple tabernacle. Yeah.
Yeah. And even, like, I mean, I know you probably want to get into other things here, but I'm just even thinking key things that are really standing out, which I heard twice now, is that the woman is under the man's authority, and that if he decides that he is suspicious, he is allowed to just go ahead and bring this all on, when she may actually be, completely innocent and being brought into this spectacle. And if a woman is also being brought into the temple, everybody can see that this woman is being brought in here. And that's a public humiliation, idea there. And all the talk that would have been happening around the water cooler, so to speak, this could, destroy a woman's reputation, even if,
She was innocent.
Yeah, even, I don't even know. It's very hardcore.
Yeah, for sure.
So why don't we follow this ritual anymore? So here's a few reasons. The judicial system is no longer vested in the church. We are not a theocracy. We no longer approve slavery. Jesus, which is sort of a similar thing, Jesus never recommended this ritual, and he certainly never inspired this ritual, just as he never inspired divorce. He's categorical on that. That was given for the hardness of their hearts And so I think it's fair to assume that this ritual was also given for the hardness of men's hearts in particular.
So are you saying then that you think that if they wouldn't have done this ritual, that they would have just stoned the woman upon suspicion, and that this was a merciful way of dealing with a woman?
Well, you might not have had a ritual at all, or you can see it as a prevention, some protection for a woman who was innocent, because she could go ahead and drink the brew and nothing would happen to her.
Okay, but then are we saying that God would keep her safe? You know, like
Um, I think that was the basic understanding. And we'll get into this with trial by ordeal a little later in our podcast. So let me ask you this. Why is this account in the Old Testament?
Well, it seems to me that it is a account of the history of the people, not necessarily of what God wanted to have happening, because I can't conceive that we are better off now. I mean, we are better off now, but we're not in a theocracy. Surely it was better in a theocracy than it is now, and yet we don't practice this, and I think that's for certain an improvement.
So I remind you that we don't practice slavery.
Mm-hmm.
We do practice divorce, to our shame. We've tried to minimize patriarchy. It's still very current, in especially church matters.
Mm-hmm.
And we've tried to mediate the monarchy by making the monarchs a head of state and not having much legislative or executive power.
Right.
okay, but I don't know. It's challenging. And when you say, you know, to our shame, we're still practicing divorce, I feel like I need to speak up about that for all the people who divorce has been a godsend and a blessing, because it has taken them out of some terrible situations, or also just really unhealthy life. So I do feel like that's quite complicated, though.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you made that caveat. I usually make it. I agree with you. But the shame part of it is that whoever's suing for divorce, it's according to Jesus because the hardness of their hearts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have no condemnation for people who divorce for whatever reason. And sometimes they are better off. Divorce is to be prepared to murder.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so at the beginning of this passage that we started reading, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses," and I know we've talked about this a little bit too in other stories, where it starts out by saying that God said, or the Lord said, or whatever. So are you saying then that this was God inspired, in the same way that sacrificial system was God inspired, to the degree that it was keeping people from doing the alternatives like sacrificing children?
Yeah, sometimes God has to choose between the lesser of two evils. Now, like, let's stay with this ritual. The possibility was that the man could simply get his friends together and stone the woman. So there's some protection for an innocent woman here, because she can say to the man, "Well, take me to the temple if you think I'm guilty, and let the priest decide."
So if it was God inspired, then was it just inspired for a limited time? Because Jesus didn't practice it. They brought a woman to him who was caught in the very act, and he didn't say, well, here, let her drink this dust-filled cup and see what happens. He forgave her and sent her on her way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I have sorry, Ian. The thought though that God, who has created life, who has, created his children, the thought that if she was guilty, that she would be at risk of becoming barren, and potentially, I don't know what's going to be happening when her belly swells in this story, but I'm assuming not good things. How could we have this kind of treatment of women, even if she was guilty? Let's assume she is, like, whatever, right? How could we have this happening to women when a woman being infertile, even in those days, that would be a way bigger shame scenario than if somebody was having fertility issues today. We would be understanding of that, and we'd be like, oh, what can we do to help and everything. But the thought that this is like bringing on barrenness to a woman, but God inspired, I have a really hard time with this.
Well, the options for the women was execution by stoning or barrenness, if she was guilty. So I don't know, as a woman, which would you choose?
Well, maybe I just can be angry about it. The unfairness of, at the very end, how it says, and the man shall not be guilty. He is innocent, but everything is upon the woman here.
Yes, and there was no equivalent ritual for a man.
Right.
If a woman felt, well, a woman wasn't even entitled to feel
no
that the man was unfaithful to her.
That's right. She was under his authority, which clearly he was doing a really good job of being a good.
You wouldn't have lasted long in the Old Testament, so I'm glad you live in the New Testament.
Lucky thing.
It's been very problematic, yes.
So is the principle behind this ritual still valid today? I want to jump in and say, yes, the principle behind the ritual is that there must be an investigation before punishment is applied. And that's true in our judicial system in the West, that you are innocent until proved guilty. So I would say the principle behind it is still valid. So let me ask this question. This curse, these consequences, was that inherent in the dust of the floor of the tabernacle and the holy water? Was there something in there like eating a cyanide sandwich or warfare? Or was this a miracle that took place?
Wow, that's I don't know. I think it depends on how you view God and how involved God is in the daily life of people. And the whole aspect of when we realize that God gives us ultimate freedom because he loves us to make choices. I don't see him causing some people to suffer because he knows they're guilty and other people not. Like, I don't know that he was that involved with that.
How about you, Sasha?
Well, I mean, it doesn't sit, the whole thing doesn't sit well. I have a hard time that in this scenario, any miracle is going to be happening, because the whole thing, I'm stupefied by the whole story.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that they all suffered negative consequences because of the bacteria factor that's going to be there on the floor, in the dirt on the floor. And unless there's a direct miracle of God to prevent that from happening, they're all going to suffer that same negative consequence.
So I'm not trying to minimize what you're saying, but I do remind you that they washed their hands and feet before they came into the temple. And it was a very clean place.
Okay.
But what about all the sacrifices that were happening there? All the
was
animals?
that was done outside. It's true, some of the blood was carried in and sprinkled on the veil.
So we are talking clean dust consumption here.
Well, where in the tabernacle? It doesn't say in the most holy place or the, you know,
This is not sacred dust here.
So this is what probably happened, is the priest went inside because non-priests were not allowed in the holy place. And so he would have gone in there and got the dust, mixed it with holy water, whatever that means. And then he would have gone through the ritual with the women outside the temple in the court.
Yeah.
So yeah, here's the other possibility, is that this was really a situation where your guilt would influence your behavior. And so maybe this idea of all these curses were threats to invoke fear in the person so that they would come clean if they were guilty. I'm guessing. I really, this a bit like Sasha, that this is beyond me.
I think that's a very legitimate observation that most people would confess before they risk drinking that solution if they were guilty.
Yeah. So let's talk about why incidents like this or rituals like this, what does including this in the Bible tell us about the inspiration of the Bible? So Warren, you've mentioned this already, is that the writer is inspired to write and is writing a history. The book of Genesis is to explain where Israel came from and how they were formed, by slavery in Egypt, by traveling in the desert, by their kings and their prophets, and so on. So this is part of that history that's included. And when it says the Lord told Moses, I take that to mean that Moses understood, being impressed by the Spirit, that he should include this ritual. Nothing more. Doesn't mean the Spirit approved it or disapproved it or inspired the ritual. It just means this needs to be part of the record.
That sounds a little bit as cloudy as that mixture the priest is bringing out from the temple. Oh boy.
No,
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead. Well, I think it does leave the opening that it wasn't necessarily God dictated. Moses had the impression that he should include this because it was their practice, wherever that came from. And I really have a hard time, as with Sasha, that this was something that God wanted them to do.
So we have all the divorce laws and the slavery laws and so on, you know. And Jesus told us God didn't want that, but he regulated it. So we can't just ignore that.
Right.
So now here's the interesting part. For many centuries, Europe used trial by ordeal. And that's what this ritual is about. The woman goes through this ordeal. As you've mentioned, people would have seen her going to the tabernacle. Usually men went to the tabernacle. It's unusual for a woman to go there. And she's taken there by her husband and in full public view. And she's going to go through this awful ritual to prove her innocence, or she's going to confess her guilt, or she goes through trial and her body reaction to the dusty holy water will prove that she's guilty. So this method of finding out the guilt of people was very common in Europe and England. And we'll talk about that. And that morphed into trial by jury. We went from trial by ordeal to trial by jury. And in part, this was possible because the state became powerful and the need for trial by ordeal was diminished. Trial by ordeal worked very well in the feudal state, where you had lords with serfs living on their property, and they could carry out this trial by ordeal. But once you had a state which had powers like judicial and police powers, they could go to trial by jury. But even trial by jury is interesting, because in trial, when a person witnesses in court today, they place the witness under oath when witnessing in court. And I think that's a carryover of this idea, is that you can actually put a person under oath like the woman was put under oath by the priest. And so we've carried that over. And in some places, you still place your hand on the Bible and you swear to tell the truth and the whole truth. And interestingly enough, perjury, get it? Perjury is to be guilty of falsehood under oath, and it is taken as a heinous crime in most countries. Look, you can tell lies outside the court, but once you've taken the oath to tell the truth, and it can be proved that you tell a lie, now you're in serious trouble.
Yeah.
And that seems a carryover to me of this ritual.
I thought you were going to use the word purge, like what this woman was going to be doing when she was going to be throwing up for the rest of the night after her.
Yeah. So let me give you a little bit more history. Trial by ordeal, an ancient judicial practice by which the guilt or innocence of the accused was determined by subjecting them to a painful or at least an unpleasant, usually dangerous experience. In medieval Europe, trial by cruentation. Now, you've never heard that word before.
No.
Cruentation, which meant that you took the corpse and you called the accused in, and then you cut the body of the dead person. And if blood oozed out of the cut, and then the person present was the murderer.
Oh, wow.
Oh my God. Wow.
And this was considered a judgment of God, that God was pointing out who was guilty. And that's what trial by ordeal was about. And that's what this incident in Numbers chapter 5 is about, is that God is going to indicate if the woman is guilty or innocent. So now we face the problem of, was this invented by the Israelites, or did they pick it up from some surrounding nation? And here this is what's interesting. The Code of Hammurabi, which is dated at 1770 BC, before the Common Era. Now, the Exodus, we think, occurred about 1500. So this is 270 years before the Exodus that it's included in the Code of Hammurabi. But even earlier, in the Code of Namu, about 2,000 years before the Common Era. This is even before Abraham, who's dated about 2,000 before the Common Era. So you can see this trial by ordeal goes back a very long way.
So didn't originate with God telling Moses to do this?
It doesn't seem that way at all.
Yeah. Okay.
So the priests used to get involved in trial by fire and water, and Pope Innocent III in 1215 forbade it. He wouldn't have the priests participating in these. So trial by ordeal became less practiced in the late Middle Ages, but the practice was not discontinued until the 16th century. And even in the 17th century, we have witch trials. Now, so there were different ways of doing trial by ordeal. One was by combat. And, you know, until quite recently, men used to fight duels.
Mm-hmm.
And the belief was that God would help the innocent man to survive and the guilty man would die.
Mm.
So you've probably never thought about this, but David and Goliath are involved in a trial by ordeal. Whoever wins the battle means that nation wins the war.
Mm.
Right.
So it's not so strange. By fire, trial by fire, was one form of torture. So what happened was they would have people walk a certain distance over red-hot plowshares or holding a red-hot iron. And innocence was established by a complete lack of injury to their feet or to their hands, but it was more common for the wound to be bandaged and re-examined 3 days later by a priest, who would pronounce that God had intervened to heal the wound, or if it was festering, the suspect was guilty and would be exiled or put to death.
So you are guilty by infection.
Yes. Very good. Guilty by infection. So
That's quite problematic.
the Israelites practiced this ordeal by fire with their children. They brought them very close to this red-hot idol. And if the child survived, it could do no wrong. It became an illustrious person in the country. But if the child died, well, God was indicating that this was not a good person.
Wow.
So Christianity then comes by this view of God as the judge very fairly then.
Well, yes, if you get all these stories about heathen gods and how they treated people, and the Greek gods and the Roman gods.
Well, especially since you're saying that the Israelites, you know, instituted a lot of these practices, maybe not quite as horrific as the neighboring nations, but in a sense, this story of the woman here, it's a torture that is being done to her. And unless she comes clean on her own, which ultimately she's not going to do well by telling that she's guilty. Yeah.
So you can have trial by boiling oil. It's practiced in parts of West Africa even today. In one version, the accused parties are ordered to retrieve an item from a container of boiling oil, with those who refuse the task being found guilty. In other versions of the trial, both the accused and the accuser have to retrieve an item from boiling oil, with a person or persons whose hand remains unscaled being declared innocent.
So my question, I guess, is, are there actually instances where people would have put their hand into boiling water and would have been totally fine? And same with that other one where they, you know, with the hand, the red hot thing. Like, are we actually saying that there were miracles and that people's hands were not burned? Like, it seems ludicrous that this is actually, with thinking humans, a way to deal with innocence or guiltiness.
I agree with you, except that I know that we all have rituals that we do which don't stand up to common sense. I could talk about that for a while, but let me move on. There was the trial by water. Now, this was used with witch hunts. And I'm sorry to tell you, witches were always women. And women were suspected far more than men of being in contact with direct evil. And so the Salem witch trials, don't read about them at night. Early morning would be a better time to read about them. So the ordeal of hot water required the accused to dip his hand in a kettle or pot of boiling water and retrieve a stone. The assessment of the injury and the consequence of a miracle or lack of one followed a similar procedure to hot oil. Ordeal by water was associated with the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th century. There was an inverse of most trials by ordeal. If the accused sank, they were considered innocent, whereas if they floated, this indicated witchcraft. Can you believe it?
So if they floated, then they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed.
Yes.
And if they sank, it was evident that they weren't guilty, but then they had died.
Well, they tied a rope around to drag them out after a little while.
Oh.
And of course, it's always only men who are in positions of power here to determine that this is what we will do to people, to decide whether they're innocent or guilty.
Yes, you have an attitude.
I do.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
this is a very
Justifiable attitude.
no, I was going to say this is a very vexing topic.
And I think you're perfectly correct in finding it that way. Okay, there was the trial by cross, which meant that the accused and the accuser would stand with their arms horizontal, and the first one whose arms dropped was the guilty one.
Mm.
So the weak people were guilty, strong people were.
Yes. So there was the trial by ingestion. And this always implied that the priest was involved, that he would bless the Eucharist, the wafer and the wine, and you took the wafer and the wine, and if you're guilty, it would be poison to you. And then there's trial by poison. In Mark 16, it says that if you drink poison, it won't harm you. That's Jesus' promise to his disciples. So you can understand where that one came from. So why don't we use the trial by ordeal anymore? We've already explained it, is that once the state originated, countrywide organization, we went to the jury system in place of this. So I want to give you some examples of trial by ordeal. Do you remember the story of Achan, who stole forbidden things from Jericho?
Yes.
Before it was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So how was his guilt determined?
Casting lots.
Casting lots. So what's that in plain English?
Drawing straws.
Drawing straws, throwing dice.
Yeah. By
and
chance.
The belief was that God would indicate who was guilty.
Yeah.
Did it work for Achan? Say yes.
Well, it worked with negative consequences for him.
Well, he was clearly shown to be guilty
Yeah.
by the trial of casting lots. Can you imagine if you're guilty and this is happening and your tribe is chosen, and then your totem is chosen, and then your family is chosen, and then finally it's you? I mean, that must have been terrifying.
I think everyone would know as soon as it started getting closer, because I think he would have been sweating so bad by then that it would have been evident.
Now, there's an interesting aside to this, and that is that it's highly improbable that Achan was the only one who stole.
Right.
He was made this scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? Was this a miracle where God intervened and made sure that the lots fell on Achan? You know, there's a lot of this in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, because to replace Judas, they chose two men and then they cast lots to decide who was the right man.
And even with the casting of lots, they chose a man and then you never hear him again.
Yeah.
And God chose Saul, who became Paul. He became the one that carried the gospel to the world.
So, you know, we could talk at length about any one of these. Jonah experienced trial by water.
But lots were also drawn to even find out who was the one who caused this problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree. But he's thrown into the water. Does he survive?
Well,
Only because God provides him a fish to swallow him up.
This proves he's innocent.
Well, I don't know that it proves he's innocent, because he was guilty. He was running away.
So I can see you don't understand trial by ordeal, Warren.
No, I don't.
No.
Apparently
If you
not.
survive the trial, that means you're innocent.
Yeah. Okay. He's innocent.
oh boy. Yeah. Interesting.
So there was a trial by ordeal for who would be leaders in Israel. The leaders of these tribes all brought a staff, and then it was put in the sanctuary, and then Aaron's staff budded and produced almonds overnight, and the other guys, nothing happened to their staffs.
Well, that I don't have a problem with. I mean, there's nothing bad happening to these people. I mean, that's okay with me. There's buds coming. That's life. That's good.
Well, if you thought you should be the leader and your staff didn't bud, that was an ordeal for you.
That's true. That would have been an ordeal.
But at least you weren't taken out and executed.
That's true. Although I don't see any women being there. I don't see any women's staffs being put into that mix there.
That's true.
Yes, we can't ordain the women yet.
We've already mentioned David and Goliath as an ordeal by trial. If you want to read a fascinating account of David and Goliath, read the one by, he wrote The Tipping Point.
Yes.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yes.
Yeah,
I did read that.
Just Google David and Goliath, Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Job was tried by multiple ordeals to determine the motive for his loyalty to God. Illness. Well, yeah.
Thankfully, we have talked about Job, because otherwise I feel like we would have to take a minute there, talk about that.
Illness was trial by ordeal for the guilt of an individual. All the curses of Leviticus 26 include things like war, famine, plague, wild beasts, and leprosy was the ultimate ordeal for indicating guilt. So when Miriam gets leprosy, even though she and Aaron have rebelled, we conclude that Miriam was actually the instigator of the leprosy, of the rebellion, because she was the one who got leprosy. So this is a trial by ordeal. So for this reason, the Jews of Jesus' day believed that if you were ill, it was because you had sinned. And so Jesus would preface his healing often by saying to the person, your sins are forgiven. So we're getting closer to disturbing trials by ordeal. The death of the firstborn in Egypt was a trial by ordeal. Those who painted blood on the doorposts were delivered from this ordeal. But if you thought that was a primitive practice, the firstborn died. We've talked about the sacrificing of children to Moloch, and Maimonides, who was a Jewish rabbi, tells us that the conniving priests of Moloch convinced people that whoever did not have their children participate in this ritual would witness the death of their children. Thus, people felt that by appeasing Moloch, the Moloch god, they would secure their children's future.
So you had to sacrifice at least one of them for the safety of the rest of them.
Well, the one might survive also.
Oh.
It wasn't foregone, a foregone conclusion that the child would die.
Okay.
Some of them survived.
Mm.
So the sacrificing of Isaac by Abram was a 3-day trial by ordeal to answer the question of, does Abram love God? You know, you can only begin to imagine what he felt in those 3 days.
Yeah.
When he's anticipating he's having to sacrifice his son. So now we come to the cross. The cross was a trial by ordeal to determine Jesus' guilt for claiming at least that he was God, and for claiming that he was Messiah, and for claiming that he was authorized to forgive sin apart from the temple. The religious leaders were watching to see if he would die and remain dead, which would prove his guilt of pretending to be God. If he resurrected, it would mean that he was telling the truth.
Wow. Yeah.
That's quite a shift in that idea there. So is that why they really wanted to keep it secret then? That he had risen?
Oh, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. If he rose, that would prove that he was innocent.
Right.
The cross was also a trial by ordeal to determine if Jesus/God is unselfish. If he escaped from the cross, it would mean that he was selfish. If he died without hope, it would mean that he was unselfish. It truly was the trial by ordeal.
Mm. Yeah.
As mentioned above, there were benefits to trial by ordeal. Excuse me. It brought God into everyday life. It brought closure to the accusation in one way or another. It prevented punishment until an attempt had been made to ascertain the guilt or innocence of the accused. You know, the desire to have God as judge, to assign guilt or innocence, is still current in teaching about the final destinies being decided by God. This is true, even though we have statements like the following. Sasha, if you'll read the first one.
Yeah, John 3:17. God sent his son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him.
And John 5:22 says, in addition, the Father judges or condemns no one. Instead, he has given the Son absolute authority to judge.
Also, John 5:27, and he, God, has given him authority to judge everyone innocent, because he is the Son of Man.
And John 8:15, you judge me by human standards, but I do not judge or condemn anyone.
And finally, in John 12:48, but all who reject me and my message will be judged or condemned on the day of judgment by the truth I have spoken.
So what do you think? What's your conclusion after reading those 5 scriptures where Jesus is speaking about judgment?
Well, it seems clear that he did not come to judge, he came to save. And that if we are in fact judged or condemned, it's because of how we've related to what he has shared, what the truth is.
Yeah, the truth he brought us about God.
Uh-huh.
So I remind you that in Revelation 6, at the end of the chapter, at the second coming, it says that the people on earth would prefer to commit mass suicide, call up the rocks and the mountains to fall on them, rather than to meet with the Lamb. Like they've judged themselves.
Yeah.
Like Judas judged himself.
It seems suddenly sad to me, though, that there's still such a prevailing view of God to be like the Old Testament God, because how do you come and have trust in him, or even trust your life into his hands if you feel that he's not safe to do that? So this seems sad. I don't have a better way of saying
it. It is tragic.
It is sad.
Tragically sad.
Yes.
You can't love a person who you fear.
No.
No.
And I think that's why wrestling through this, and why I still have a lot of issues with these stories and with this idea of ordeal, like a trial by ordeal, because I'm thinking through history of time, right? And thinking about how many people lost their lives or were physically injured and harmed because, they were tortured in a sense here, and that this was also done in God's name, and somehow, I don't know, like that God's name could be brought into this, into something so negative.
Yeah. Have you ever heard a joke about somebody arriving at the gates and he's got to deal with Saint Peter?
Yes, right.
So why do we tell stories like that? Because we still see God as a celestial judge.
Yeah.
And he's got the sub-judge, who is Peter, and he's going to decide if you get in or not.
Yeah, right.
But Jesus kept telling us, guys, you need to make a decision. If you believe in me, you've moved from death to life. You've moved from darkness to light. You will never be judged or condemned.
Yeah.
But we don't take responsibility for ourselves. So we keep blaming our destiny on God. Oh, God's going to decide. No, it's our decision.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings make their choices about how to live their lives and who they will have faith in. It is us who determine our final destinies. And our final destiny is a consequence of the relationship we have with God and ourselves and other people. And God is not subjecting us to trial by ordeal to determine if we are fit for heaven. Our lives are an ordeal, but they're not planned this way by God. He never meant that we would have to run the gauntlet of life. He meant for us to live happily ever afterwards from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So our destiny is a consequence of the relationship we have with him, not because he's going to punish or reward us, but because we've fallen in love with him.
Yeah.
And hopefully he'll take care of all the people who were given this, given a harsh view of God and didn't know what to do with it. And so maybe pulled back to preserve themselves, and that he would take care of them because he is their daddy and knows them and knows the pain and the trauma that has been caused by a harsh view of him. I'm hoping is the question.
Sasha, you have a very tender, kind heart. I'm happy for it. I'm happy you're here on the podcast. Now I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think you are kinder than God?
Definitely not.
So all your concerns are magnified in God's heart.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
See, the kindness of your heart is a faint reflection of God's heart.
Mm.
Dear God, we are in your presence. And in your presence, we remember the goodness, the kindness, the compassion, the affection of your heart for us. You truly are wonderful. We worship you. Amen.
Amen.
You will find the PDF document that we're following today on our website, rediscoveringgod.ca, where the recordings, the PDFs, the podcasts are all listed there, and you can share that website with your friends and they can follow along.
We'd also really love to invite you to the Monday night Zoom discussion, where we all gather in fellowship with each other, all us listeners of the podcast, where we can come with our questions, comments, thoughts, resources. It's a wonderful time of encouragement where we get to affirm each other and encourage each other. So that's Monday nights at 7:30 Mountain Time. You can just type in 403-506-9201, and we'd love to have you there.